Samuel Doveri Vesterbye, the director of the ENC and the host of the MEDIATIZED EU podcast series. Today's discussion is essentially part of a series of podcasts which are dedicated to our project, EU-funded MEDIATIZED EU under the Horizon project, which essentially studies how the media discourses are constructed to foster or to hamper European sentiments and how it resonates among the general population, as well as what we call the elite media public triangle. And so today's recording will really help our audience members or listeners who are probably policymakers or academics or journalists really try to understand how research components that we're studying in the media analysis as well as the interview analysis will kind of contribute towards understanding of Europeanization in the media in each of the target countries. And today we're together with one of our partners from Ireland. But before I go on to present to you, I'd just maybe like to plug our project, which for anyone who's watching and who's interested in media and Europeanization and these subjects that we're dealing with, it's strongly advisable that you go visit www.mediatized.eu or subscribe to our newsletter, as well as potentially visit us on Twitter, where we're reasonably active at mediatized_EU. But before we go on to discussing the actual findings of this research, which has been going on for quite some time now, and which still is not over at all, I would like to introduce you to my research colleague, Dr. Tetyana Lokot, who is an associate professor and who's also the project coordinator of this whole research project, which I know is a mammoth task and a very, very important role. So I'm very, very happy to have you here with us, essentially. Let me perhaps start by adding that, we're 28 months into the project now, and we've already completed the initial part, which is desk research, and we've also done, the media analysis in which we really go through, thousands of transcripts and from media outlets from all the different countries that we're studying across the European Union and non-EU countries as well. And perhaps the most pertinent question is, in your case, in the case of Ireland, what do these findings look like from the media analysis?
Thanks. Pleasure to be on the podcast and pleasure to be asked this question because, as you said, we are really in the most exciting part of our work in terms of collecting data, but also starting to analyze things and to see them kind of triangulate and come together. So for Ireland, just to preface the media analysis findings, Ireland is traditionally, if you look at the Eurobarometer surveys, it is by far one of the most enthusiastic countries when it comes to EU support. So traditionally, I don't think it's ever been less than 80%. The Irish population is really, really positive, and they see the EU as being a good thing and contributing to the well-being of the Irish nation. At the same time, Ireland is a very peculiar actor in the European sphere because it has this long-standing tradition of military neutrality. It's not a member of NATO. At the same time, it's been through some complicated things in a few recent years because of Brexit, right? So we are in a really interesting situation, which actually comes through also in the media analysis results. So where we're looking at, the second half of 2022 and of 2021 and the start of 2022, this is where our media data comes from. And we also managed to get some of the data that kind of captures coverage of the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So really, the key kind of topics that we can see in our media analysis had to deal with, first of all, kind of the general notions of how Ireland and Irish elites, Irish politicians, Irish media, journalists, commentators think about the EU, dealing with EU policy. They also have to obviously talk about Brexit and its implications for Ireland's relationship with the EU and the UK. And of course, we also capture Irish coverage of the EU's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So overwhelmingly, again, the discourses that we capture are predominantly pragmatic. So they talk about really practical things such as, the impact of kind of EU's dominance in terms of enforcing certain policy themes or certain regulations, and then how do countries deal with them. Or they have to deal with, say, how well the EU performed in terms of reacting to the COVID pandemic and its implications, both in terms of public health care, well-being, economic support. And again, the feeling there is that the EU has done really well, right? So the EU has done really well in terms of providing support during COVID for Ireland and other EU countries. It's also done really well in terms of helping Ireland and showing solidarity with Ireland during Brexit, and being very conscious of the very fragile situation, regarding the question of the peace process on the island of Ireland and the border, and the economic issues that stem from there. So those discourses are overwhelmingly positive. Overall, Irish media coverage of elite opinions is also assessing EU's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine as really positive. Although we have some divisions there in terms of, on the one hand, it seems like there is solidarity in the EU, in Irish opinion, regarding the response to Russia's aggression. On the other hand, there are some internal divisions on key issues, right? Such as, for instance, should Ukraine be joining the EU and how soon? So the feeling is that it should, but there's less certainty of how soon that should happen. And then again, just in terms of other divisions, in terms of, say, values, right? There is this strand in the coverage that we captured that talks about the fact that, well, some EU members don't really align, and here we're mostly talking about Poland and Hungary, right? And the fact that they are sort of deviating from the overall European values, such as rule of law and human rights, right? So there is that topic of backsliding. But one of the more interesting things, and I think this will be kind of the final really big finding from the media analysis for me, is in Ireland we see this reinvigoration of the discussion about Ireland's own neutrality in the context of the renewed conversation in the EU about defense and security, and the EU's own stance on, are we a peace union, or are we a union that should also be talking about defense and security? Should we be reallocating our budgets? Should we be revising our position on what we do for each other as a community in terms of defense and security? And this, of course, is brought on by response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the support that the EU has over time provided, that has grown very quickly to Ukraine in terms of giving it lethal, non-lethal, economic, and all other kinds of support. And for Ireland, this is reflected also in the discourse about Ireland's own position, right? Because the star quote here from Irish Prime Minister or Taoiseach Micheál Martin has been that, well, we are militarily neutral, and we remain so, but we are not politically neutral or morally neutral. And what this really means in practice is that Ireland has been very active in promoting issues of justice, support for the temporarily displaced Ukrainians, offering all sorts of humanitarian aid, medical support, and even non-lethal military support, so providing everything they can up to the point where we're starting to talk about.
Do you then see a difference, because you mentioned that in the media analysis, you were still going through media outlets as Russia invaded Ukraine? Mm-hmm. Do you then see a change in discourse from before to after?
Well, that's the change that I'm talking about. So there was actually a kind of simmering discussion of neutrality, because always Ireland is talking about, how good or not good is our own defense force. We're not really funding them properly, but also we don't really need them because we had the UK and then the US and then the EU kind of supporting us. We don't need to have our defense force. And suddenly you're faced with this historically unprecedented situation where you have a war in Europe, and that is a very large scale war, and that affects obviously not just Ukraine but other countries. So it's interesting because we only had maybe a couple of months at the end of our media analysis term where that the invasion was already happening, and we had these media discourses. But in terms of mentions of EU and EU policy, they constitute a disproportionate amount, right? So we suddenly have this influx of coverage and opinions and news stories that deal with the EU and its role in the conflict, and also the impact on Ireland's own discussion about its own military neutrality. So that really has been one of the key changes that we spotted, is that now there is a lot more debate inside Ireland, both about its own defense role and neutrality and budgets for that, and alongside that, the EU's role, and whether it's any changes warranted in how the EU thinks about its own defense and security, and how autonomous it is or isn't.
It's funny you mentioned that. Also, in our research in Belgium, we had a disproportionate amount of media, of course, dedicated toward the war in Ukraine, and I think that that's something that many of the partners have witnessed, and I see a lot of similarities between the different partners in this consortium. I wanted to move on to a second question, which is, I think, equally relevant. We've just been speaking about the media analysis that all of us have been conducting, but of course now we've all embarked, and some have finished as well, on the elite interviews, which essentially mean that all consortium partners have been interviewing journalists and with politicians and other media experts in this sphere. And of course, we've been using this quite innovative methodology that one of our colleagues have been speaking about in one of the other podcasts, which is Q methodology, which is a very innovative and interesting way of studying this. And so I wanted to ask you, what have your findings been with regards to the elite interviews in Ireland?
It's been a really interesting process, and I have to say, right, so our colleague Lika has described the methodology. It is really innovative, and I think it's really interesting in that it combines this quantitative part with the qualitative in-depth interviews. And I have to say, we were fearful, as I think many of our other partners, that the interviewees would kind of be maybe repelled or like maybe be spooked a little bit by this, like, what is this? Would you want us to like put statements on the grid and rank them? But they actually, after kind of initial hesitation, they were all really engaged and really interested, because it's such a weird, kind of innovative and unusual method of starting a discussion, about their opinions about the role of the EU and the relationship between Ireland and the EU. So again, we've seen really good active engagement from both the political elites and the journalists and the media elites as well. We expected there not to be much disagreement, because as I said, overall, even among the elites, there is a kind of predominant sense that everybody feels really positive about the role of the EU. But it turned out that there was some disagreement, and it's actually when you really get down into the nitty-gritty of like, what do people think the EU is doing well, or in relation to Ireland, or in relation to broader EU policies, and what maybe isn't going so well. And I think on the one hand, while we're seeing from interviews that nobody really disagrees with the fact that, yes, the EU has these shared values, when we're talking about democracy, we're talking about human rights, justice. At the same time, there is a sense that when it comes to practical implementation, right, making policy, or making sure that EU members kind of are in agreement or working together on certain issues, where we're not just talking about theories and values, there is a bit more disagreement, because it's very clear that the Irish elites are also very sensitive to places where there are tensions and where there are disagreements, right? So for instance, I think there was quite a bit of comments in interviews, well, for one thing, regarding Brexit, right, which is obviously a really sensitive issue for Ireland. And some commentators felt, that, the EU did exceptionally well, they're always on our side. On the other hand, right, there were also commentators who said, well, the EU is on the EU's side. It's not really about Ireland, it's about safeguarding kind of the overall coherence of EU and EU policy. So there was a bit of a disagreement there. The other thing people felt very strongly about, I think, is the idea of solidarity among EU member states, right? Because for them, the solidarity wasn't kind of holistic. There's solidarity on some issues, but on other issues, you could very quickly start to see disagreements or breakdowns, like when it comes to climate change and climate change mitigation policies and how well states are actually acting on them. When it comes to, again, issues of security and defense, in particular in the case of the war, but also even before the war, or for instance, on issues like implementing sanctions, right? I think there was a big debate kind of in our interview responses with regard to, is the EU doing well in terms of, are the sanctions sufficient? Are they strong enough to deter Russia or to stop Russian aggression? And there was a big debate there in terms of some people saying, yeah, these are really great sanctions and they're not yet over. The new packages keep being rolled out. and other people saying, well, maybe the sanctions in theory are good, but we don't see uptake from all members equally. There are some problematic EU members which don't want to subscribe to certain sanctions because those sanctions are also hurting them, right? So there was a debate there. And certainly on issues of neutrality, which I just talked at length about, there was also a lot of disagreement because, again, it seems like there is the issue of EU's own security and defense policy, and then for Ireland it's also a really sensitive issue internally. So a lot of commentators felt that we should sort of talk about those issues separately, but it's also really difficult, right? Because Ireland is part of the EU, and so in a way it's impossible to have a conversation about Ireland without also putting it into the context of EU's own security and defense developments.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you one last question, then I'll ask you to be brief because we're trying to do these podcasts within a 20-minute margin. You have a pretty unique position in this project, with being project coordinator. You get the opportunity to look at all the different projects' findings. And I wanted to ask you, number one, have you seen any sign of continuation between the media analysis into the elite interviews, and do you also see some symmetry or convergence between some of the findings across the European Union and Georgia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we are in a very privileged position because our consortium is unique in that we have, old EU member states, newer EU member states, and we also have Georgia, which is a kind of a country that aspires to be an EU member. And which recently was slightly disappointed, right, when the Ukraine and Moldova were granted candidate status and Georgia wasn't, for the reasons that I'm sure my Georgian colleague has talked about. In terms of the continuation, it's been really interesting because obviously for us, the statements that we use in the interviews to stimulate our respondents are derived from the media analysis. And while we see some statements that are more or less common or that touch upon common issues in the different media data sets, there's also quite a lot of heterogeneity. So there are a lot of statements that are specific to a particular national context in the EU. But despite that, we can see some common themes. So one of the themes that for me came very strongly through is this idea of the EU as a normative power. So an institution that doesn't just govern its members for the benefit of all members, but that also sets certain standards, sets certain rules, sets certain ideals and values, and somehow attempts to also promote those values throughout its member states, but also beyond, right? So to change kind of not just the local or the European policy scene, but also to promote those values beyond. And I think that has really come through in more than one country, and perhaps almost in all countries. So that is why it's also really useful to point out that, right now we're focusing on country-specific data collection and analysis. The next big stage for us, as you said, we're in the second half of our project already. The next big stage for us will be the comparative case studies, where we will be working to really drag out those commonalities, but also differences, and then to attempt to understand what they tell us about the changing notion of Europeanization. What does it mean to each country? Can we derive something about what Europeanization means for the EU as a whole? And that, I think that's our lofty but achievable goal, which we're going to try to work on in the next slightly under 2 years.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for being able to both comprehensively summarize the case of Ireland, but also to be able to draw comparisons and challenges and differences that exist across our partners in the consortium, and also for looking ahead and telling us what we'll be probably finding in the near future. And so on that note, I think our discussion will be coming to an end. Thank you again, Tanya, and I'm Doveri Vesterbye, and this was the MEDIATIZED EU podcast series.